Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. I get the honor of welcoming everyone this evening. So welcome to the Spring 2021 Provost Faculty Symposium. My name is Ashley Chisholm, and I'm an associate professor in the Legal Studies Department on campus, and I'm one of the symposium committee members. First off, I'd like to begin with a short history of the symposium. The Provost Faculty Symposium series began in 2014 to foster faculty research, initially supporting the research of our junior faculty members, but in 2016, the Provost began inviting senior faculty, and research by faculty from Fant Memorial Library were also included in the series at this point. The symposium is organized by a committee comprised of faculty from each college and an at-large representative. The committee members work with their respective deans who determine the selection of presenters. Now it is my honor to introduce the Provost, Dr. Scott Tollison, for his welcome before we begin with the presentations. Dr. Tollison serves as Professor of Information Systems and Provost BPAA at MUW. Prior to his service as Provost, Dr. Tollison served as the Dean for the College of Business and Professional Studies. He is a former honorary commander of the 16th Medical Squadron at Columbus Air Force Base, a 2014 graduate of the Mississippi Community College Leadership Academy, a Mississippi Business Journal Top 50 Under 40, and a Leadership Mississippi Class of 2021 participant. As a native of West Point, Mississippi, he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in information systems and a doctorate in instructional systems and workforce development from Mississippi State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tollison.
Thank you, President Chisholm. I just want to welcome everyone to the Faculty Research Symposium. You know, in addition to providing high-quality teaching and service to our campus, our community, and the world, our faculty are also performing top-notch research and engaging in thought-provoking creative endeavor. And I'm so thankful for this symposium and the opportunity it gives us to share knowledge from our respective disciplines and to inspire one another. So to our presenters, thank you for sharing of your knowledge. To the symposium committee, thank you for organizing this wonderful event. And to everyone watching, thank you for being part of this event, and thank you for the contributions you're making to this campus and the broader world. While we may not be in the same room, I guess we're in a virtual room, but not in the same physical room, a love of learning connects us all. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Sally Pearson, who will introduce our first presenter.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Well, I'm really excited to get this going. As you heard our chitter chatter before it started, we've got some interesting presentations to be heard. So our first presenter is Dr. Bliss from the Psychology and Family Science Department. She has her Bachelor's of Science in Behavioral Neuroscience from the University of Kansas, a Master's of Art in Psychology, and a PhD in Experimental Psychology from the University of Mississippi. Dr. Bliss studies the effects of instructional technology on student cognition and performance. Dr. Bliss started at the W in August of 2020 and will share with us research titled Lecture, Capture, Live Streaming, and Online Discussion Forums in Large Face-to-Face Classes Pre-Pandemic. Have at it, Dr. Bliss.
I'm going to share my screen with y'all if my mouse will work. I'm going to time myself just to make sure I don't go wild here. So I did change the title on you, but it's the same thing. I just felt that was way too long and too intimidating of a title to have. So this is research that I initially started back in 2017. It is a part of my dissertation. It took us about 6 months to actually get IRB approval for this. And then it took 1 semester to collect the data and 1.5 years across 6 RAs and myself to even code all of the data. So I'm not going to go into everything. I'm just going to talk about the basics of what you really need to know. And I also really don't want to focus too much on the background information, because I think a lot of us know already the downsides of using technology in classrooms. So I'll just kind of briefly go through a crash course and then get straight into the study. So there has been a lot of research since 1928, really, about using technology in classrooms. And I know that sounds shocking, 1928, but that was when they actually invented the teaching machine. It goes all the way back to the 60s as well with Skinner and Pressey and all of that. But there's just overwhelming amount of research that says that technology in classrooms is bad because students are multitasking, they're distracted by other students multitasking. And we also have a lot of studies that show that handwritten notes results in higher recall than typed notes. But then there's a lot of research, particularly that started coming about in around 2014, 2015, that starts to say that this technology really isn't all that bad in classrooms, that perhaps there's a good type of multitasking where instead of students looking at YouTube videos or shopping online, they're actually looking at concepts from class. And the students that do that do actually have better performance in the classroom. They've replicated that initial study of handwritten versus typed notes and found that it's not holding up anymore with this newer generation of students. Also, there's some stuff on distraction by other students, but that's really kind of the heart of what my dissertation is. So this then introduced to the field was active learning platforms. If you haven't heard of an active learning platform, basically it's a technology that houses a lot of different types of technology into one. So instead of going to Zoom and then YouTube and then a third-party captioning service and all of these other things, it's all housed within one platform. And primarily, these active learning platforms focus on lecture capture. So it's mostly face-to-face lecture capture style of a program. But then it also has some fun things for the students like live polling. You probably are familiar with clickers. This is better because they can use their phones. They have discussion boards. They have note-taking applications. Like every active learning platform is different, but they all have these four main basic components to them. And because of this, some research started coming out starting all the way back into 2006, where everyone really wants to focus on the lecture capture aspect. Like they really want to know, does lecture capture actually help students? What students go back and watch the videos? What parts of the videos do they watch? And does this actually have an impact on their grades? Is it worth it? And they immediately started to notice that students started skipping class because they had the lecture videos. And a lot of these lecture capture platforms didn't have the ability for instructors to actually look at the behaviors that the students were doing. So like in Canvas or on YouTube, you can see how many people viewed your video, right? You can see if a student opened the link, but you can't see how much of that video the student watched. And you can't see how much of the slides the student has gone through, what percentage of a reading they've actually done. But with a lot of these active learning platforms, you can do that. So not only do you see, did Sally watch, this video, I can see Sally watch 75% of the video or 1% of the video, which was actually fairly common. So there's a lot of research, again, that was done that brought up all these concerns. But for the most part, like I said, it's all been focused on that lecture capture and how do students perceive their learning. And we know, if you don't know already, students kind of overemphasize their learning when it comes from things with technology or things that they like. So judgments of learning are not accurate to the actual performance or outcome of that student. Nonetheless, the majority of the research on active learning platforms is focused on that. So this is where I came in, and a little bit of a reason why it took 6 months to get through IRB, because I had 2 classes that I was teaching. They were back to back. They were identical courses. We had about 105 students in each class. They were 50-minute class sessions every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I wanted one class to be taught completely without the active learning platform, but with everything else, and then another class with the active learning platform. So I had to go full IRB. And it took, like I said, quite a while to get them to say, okay, you can actually do an experiment with your class. I do want to mention that all of the due dates, the exam dates, the lecture content, all of this was the same. And I have way more variables in this study than, like I said, what I'm going to present to you today. I actually had RAs who stood at the front of the classroom making sure every student got their attendance checked. I had to have a clicker in my pocket counting every time a student asked a question. Then we had to review hours and hours of that video to make sure data was accurate. So it's intense. So overall, in this study, we had 205 students total. The average age was 19, and most of them were female. And this is pretty typical of any of our introductory classes at the University of Mississippi. You can see I have kind of the breakdown of what percentage of the students there were in the classroom. And these were not significantly different between the 2 study groups that I had. The active learning platform that we used was Echo 360. There was a combined effort across multiple different departments to pitch in just about $100,000, no big deal, for me to actually start doing these studies. But the downside was that I had to be the administrator of the entire university and 5,000 students and 40 professors. So that was fun. I did get paid at one point. Anyways, that's not significant. I want to just kind of show you what each class had. So the non-echo course, their physical attendance was documented. We had scanners in the classroom. Like I said, I had RAs who were there making sure that everyone's attendance was noted. They had in-class activities and homework. They had Blackboard quizzes. Blackboard is like Canvas, if you don't know. They all had in-class exams. They all had Twitter. I'm a big Twitter user, so everyone was following on Twitter. That's how we would have virtual office hours. And they all had access to the PowerPoint slides. But with the Echo course, they had a lot more. Of course, they have all the features that Echo offered at the time. So not only was I recording lectures for the students, but I was live streaming those lectures. So if a student wasn't able to be in class, they could literally attend class from wherever. This was pretty weird before, the pandemic happened. So if that sounds familiar now, but back then it was very weird. They had access to the previously recorded lectures. They had a note-taking platform, and this note-taking platform is so cool. The moment they would start typing a note, whether it was in a face-to-face class or it was on like a video they're watching later, it would index that note to the video and the slides that they were viewing at the time. So if they started typing, "This is on the test," they didn't have to write out everything that's on the test. They could just click the note and go directly to that part of the video where I had said whatever it was that they were trying to take a note on. They also had a live discussion board that was kind of like the Twitter style. It looks like Twitter, that they would post during, before, and after classes. And then they also had searchable content. So all of my videos were captioned to 99% accuracy. They could type in a word and they could find every video across everything in the class, what that information was, what they're looking for. So the class kind of became Google in a way. So let's just get down to the nitty gritty of it. Everyone's first question is, what were their grades like? The average exam grades I have here. On the left of the cluster in the light blue, you see these are the echo classes. In the gray on the right side of the cluster is the non-echo classes. The average grade for the echo class was 77.7, and the average grade for non-echo was 74.6. And this was statistically significant, roughly 3%. And what's interesting in all the studies that I've done, I'm comparing classes throughout that whole 3-year period. 3-year period? Yeah, the whole 3-year period, we see this consistent 3% increase across the board. So it wasn't class specific, but for this study, it was. You also see we have a lot more A's and a lot less F's in the class. I average out their end of the semester grades. So their overall grade in Echo is 87.9, but it was 86.4 for the non-Echo class. And this was not statistically significant. So the overall grades weren't. But then I started looking into the grades, I build up a little bit more. We are required to offer a certain percentage of extra credit in our intro courses across all of the SCI intro classes. And it's just based on participation, if a student simply shows up to an appointment. So when I remove all the extra credit, then we see this big difference in the overall end of semester grades of the 85.2 compared to about 82.5. So there was a big difference in the knowledge base grading, and the students in the Echo class were less likely to seek out extra credit because they kind of just didn't need to. They were pretty comfortable with their grade and their understanding of the material. The next thing, I know I'm going quickly, the next thing is attendance. So I did see what was pretty classic across all the classes or all the studies that have talked about lecture capture, where they do skip class more often when they have that lecture capture than when they don't have the lecture capture. But again, one interesting thing about this class at the time was that I was live streaming, and I was able to take live streaming attendance. Echo automatically did it for me, so I didn't have to take screenshots or save chats. When I included the live streaming attendance, there was no significant difference between these groups. So even though the students weren't actually physically coming to the classroom, a lot of the times it was because they just couldn't. I polled them for why, and most of it was their car broke down. They woke up late. They just felt sick. I had 5 students across both classes that were in the hospital from the same car accident. One student was there for pretty much the rest of the semester. And yes, I did remove their data from my analyses because that was a weird case. The next thing that I wanted to look at was verbal communication. So I've read a lot of studies that show that when students are verbally generating questions in classrooms, they tend to have higher grades. So I wanted to know if having that live discussion board was actually going to stop the students from posting questions or speaking questions verbally, that they would just post questions online and that we wouldn't see that outcome. But I actually saw the opposite happen. So the number of verbal questions asked across the semester in the class without Echo 360 was only 74. And this is around like 100-ish students in the class. There are only 74 questions the entire semester. In the Echo 360 class, the verbal questions they asked was 169. That's more than double the amount of verbal questions that was asked in this class. In addition to that 169, they posted 250 in the discussion boards across the entire semester. So overall, I had 419 questions from the active learning platform course. Then I had from the class without it, which was just simply 74. So something was taking place here that did make them ask more verbal questions, even though they had that opportunity to post them anonymously online. I'll get into a little bit with the multitasking. For this course, I asked them how often they use a technological device for non-class related activities. You can see the Echo class kind of reports more often using the technological devices for non-class related activities. But then when I started asking them about what they were actually doing in the classroom, and then we coded all of this open-ended data, we divided it up into on task and off task and found that both classes were doing the same off tasking. But the class that had the active learning platform, they were doing more on task type activities than the other class. So it does promote good multitasking if you want to buy into good multitasking. For distractions, I guess I know I'm going quickly. I did want to look at something called the actor observer effect. Basically, what the actor observer effect is when you and I do the same thing, but I do it and it doesn't harm anybody. It's not bad. Like, I'm good for doing it. It's okay for me to slip up maybe. But if you do that same thing, then you're just a bad person. So what I was expecting to see in both of these classes were students saying that other students using technology devices were distracting to them, but when they use technology devices, they were not distracting others. And I saw that in the non-Echo class. And this is a class where hardly any students really have out their laptops. They have their phones, but they're trying to hide it. But what I saw when I asked them the other question of how distracting they thought they were, for the Echo class, we no longer had this actor observer effect. In fact, they didn't even think, I know I'm switching back and forth here, but they didn't even think that other people's technology was really distracting to them. And I think a lot of this came from the fact that every single student had their laptops open to the exact same page. So they didn't have this fear of missing out by seeing someone else going on Amazon or going on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. Like, they are all conforming that same level of technology. So perhaps the conformity of the instruction or the technological devices in the classroom can reduce the distraction effect that we often see in classrooms where one or two students will have their laptop out doing something else. So in conclusion, active learning platforms, they may increase student learning. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done. I have tons of it that I'm trying to get out there right now. Remote attendance is kind of a null issue now that we've had COVID. We know that students still come to class for the most part. They might not turn on their camera, but they still come to class and they're still learning, right? It looks like we do have an increase in communication. We get rid of that FOMO when everyone's using the same technological devices. And overall, there are positive outcomes from it, not just from the students thinking it's good, but their actual performance. I know I've gone to 15 minutes, so I'm going to end it there.
Wow, thank you very much. That's interesting. And we will get to some questions at the end. So everybody hold their questions, write them down so we can get back to Dr. Bliss. The next, wow, that's great. The next presenters that we have are Dr. Elizabeth Fountain and Dr. Lindsay Mitchell from the Baccalaureate Nursing Program. Dr. Fountain has 13 years of nursing experience in the areas of neonatology, women's health, gastroenterology, and family practice. And Dr. Lindsay Mitchell has 13 years of nursing experience in the areas of critical care, women's health, and family practice. Both Dr. Fountain and Dr. Mitchell are currently assistant professors in the BSN program here at the W, and their research is entitled Antibiotic Stewardship, Implementation of a Prescriber Policy for Bacterial Infections. Go for it, girls.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with y'all. Okay, you should be able to see this is our poster that we did for this research. And Dr. Mitchell and I had kind of discussed different areas of research. And one thing we had talked about was just something I think all of us have experienced at some point or another is, we get sick and what do most of us want? We want an antibiotic, right? That's kind of our first thought anytime we have a sinus, headache or congestion or any kind of problems. Most people think about antibiotics. So we started doing some research and we found that Mississippi actually has one of the highest rates of prescribing antibiotics in the United States. And we started looking at a local campus health center and talked to them and found that the nursing coordinator expressed that one of the things that she sees often is that patients come in, no matter what their problem is, they often request an antibiotic. And I think it's just because that's what a lot of people are used to hearing about on TV or in just common discussion. So we decided that we wanted to do some research about that. And given that much of the patient population at this campus health center is high school and college age clients, and they often request antibiotics, we got to thinking, well, is there some kind of policy that guides how antibiotics are prescribed here? So we found that there wasn't at that time, and we felt that there could be a need for a policy and to make sure that prescribers are prescribing antibiotics as directed by the CDC guidelines. So the purpose of our research was to implement a guideline that the CDC has called the Adult Treatment Recommendations for Antibiotic Prescribing. And what that would help do is help guide providers, whether it's physicians or nurse practitioners, in when they should prescribe antibiotics and why they should prescribe them. So what kind of symptoms would the patients need to meet? What kind of criteria? And this health center is primarily staffed by nurse practitioners. So we would mainly be talking to the nurse practitioners about this guideline policy. So when we started looking at research, we decided to use Edward Deming's change management model as our theoretical framework because this project would be based on quality improvement. And again, like I said, the setting was a campus health center in a small university in the southern region of the United States. And the demographics of the health center were primarily male and female college students ages 18 to 25 years of age. Also, faculty and staff are allowed to attend the health center along with their families. So there could be some outliers there, but on average, 18 to 25. But because of faculty, staff, and families being there, we really are dealing with patients of all ages, races, and gender. So after providing education to the providers about the CDC's adult treatment recommendations for antibiotic prescribing, Dr. Mitchell and I then at that time did a chart audit. And what we did was we looked at patients who were 18 years of age or older, and we selected charts where patients had one of the following diagnoses. And what we looked at was if they had the diagnosis of acute rhinosinusitis, acute uncomplicated bronchitis, the common cold or a nonspecific upper respiratory infection, if they had pharyngitis, or acute uncomplicated cystitis. And the reason we chose these diagnoses were because they correlated with the CDC's guideline, but also these are really common complaints that patients would come in for and that prescribers would possibly treat with antibiotic therapy. So during a 6-week period, these charts were audited
to see if prescribers followed the prescribing recommendations from the CDC and to see how those findings were compared to charts from patients seen approximately a year ago with similar diagnosis. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mitchell to talk about our results.
Thank you, Dr. Felton. So for our results, in 2018, we audited 62 charts, and that was prior to the education on the CDC recommendations. Once we did that, we found that there was 58.1% of antibiotic prescribed that adhered to the CDC adult treatment recommendations for antibiotic prescribing. However, there was 41.9% of antibiotics prescribed that were not compliant with the CDC guidelines. In 2019, we went back and audited 52 charts, and that was after we had provided education on the CDC recommendations. On those results, we had 76.9% of antibiotics that were prescribed were compliant with the CDC guidelines, and there was 23.1% that were not compliant with the CDC guidelines. There was a total increase in antibiotic prescribing compliance with the CDC guidelines of 18.8%. We also found that there was a trend while we were editing that there was usually more than one diagnosis listed in the chart, but the plan of care was not always clear in regard to which diagnosis the plan of care applied to in the chart. For our practice implications, there was education provided regarding the CDC's adult treatment recommendation for antibiotic prescribing, and it was effective. The CDC's adult treatment recommendations for antibiotic prescribing improved nurse practitioners' decision-making in prescribing antibiotics. For our recommendation, we encouraged implementing a policy to ensure continued use of the CDC policy to ensure evidence-based treatment in the clinic. And we also addressed the importance of making the plan of care clear when there was more than one diagnosis listed in the chart. And that wraps up our presentation and our research.
Okay, that was interesting, and I got some questions for you. So now we'll go to, Dr. Andrew Nguyen from the Psychology and Family Science Department. Dr. Nguyen is an assistant professor in that department and primarily conducts research within the areas of social influence and relationships. He hails from Toronto, Canada, and currently teaches psychology, statistics, and research methods at the title of his research that he's going to share with us tonight is Stealing Thunder, Making the Best of a Bad Situation across Different Confessions Specificities. Thank you, Dr. Nguyen.
Actually, I just shortened it to making the best of a bad situation because once I got through like most of the talk, I realized that I had to drop some studies at the end. So that confession specificity is gone. I'm just gonna talk, give an overview of those studies at the end. But anyhow, hi everyone. Hope you can see my screen. Today I want to talk to you about a specific type of damage control. Now, we've all been there, right? We've all made mistakes that we've regretted, and now we're faced with a dilemma. Do we try to hide it and hope nobody finds out? Or do we try to get ahead of the damage by admitting to everything we've done rather than risking it be discovered and revealed by a third party? And it's this latter strategy that's known in literature as stealing thunder. And the logic is that if you're the one revealing this information that could be potentially damaging to you, then the damage will still be less than if it came from somebody else. You'll probably still suffer some damage because after all, you still did the deed, right? But it wouldn't be as bad as if you didn't admit to anything at all. Now, there are several reasons why this tactic might be effective. One explanation comes from commodity theory, which states that the value of the product depends on how scarce that product is. Therefore, if the product is the damaging information and we make this information less scarce by preemptively revealing it, then we'll be making the information less rare and thus less valuable. And the information that's less valuable is less likely to be heavily scrutinized and pursued. And that's fantastic for you if the information is damaging. Now, another reason comes from research in the impression formation literature, which shows that people who disclose potentially damaging information about themselves tend to enjoy higher credibility and persuasiveness than those who do not. And to date, the literature does seem to suggest that this strategy does tend to decrease the damage of the information and the harshness of various judgments against you. And it's been shown to work pretty reliably across a number of different contexts, such as legal, political, and in business settings. Now, the kind of stealing thunder that's been looked at in the literature involves a very specific admission of guilt to specific concrete acts. But interestingly, we can look to the real world and sometimes see another version of stealing thunder, a vague general confession where few specific details are provided. And one famous example that I'll talk about is when Bill Clinton ran for president. There were all these rumors and stories about his infidelities. And so one day he just came out and made an admission that he had caused pain in his marriage. So that is an admission of guilt, to be sure. That is an attempt to steal thunder before the truth of the transgressions could be revealed by third parties. But the admission was super vague. As you can imagine, plenty of things could fall into the category of, causing pain in my marriage. I'm doing air quotes. I don't know if you can see it. Causing pain in my marriage. And, in a similar manner, George W. Bush, when he was running for president, he made an early admission that he had problems with drinking in his past. That was it. No details about when, where, what specific thing he did that was the problem. Once again, a very general kind of confession, lacking in detail. As it turns out, he had received a DUI for driving under the influence. Now, presumably, this general admission, this usage of the stealing thunder tactic is done because people want the benefits of stealing thunder without having to divulge all the details about their personal life or feelings. So the big question is, does this type of stealing thunder work? Stealing thunder in the literature has always been used with very specific confessions, but this is not how it's always used in real life. Wouldn't it be great if stealing thunder worked with these general confessions as well? And that's the goal of this whole program of research, to find out if these kinds of general confessions buy you anything. So the first study was conducted with a sample of 300 students who were taking intro psych classes. The setup is all participants read about a politician who makes a statement where he's strongly against corruption and mishandling of public funding. And this initial statement was created based on a very generic press template. And then participants were randomly assigned to one of several conditions. The first control group is the condition that gives a baseline of when no transgression has been committed. So in this condition, nothing else was revealed about the politician from any source. This is just to find out how you would evaluate this person when he hasn't committed any transgressions. The second control group gives us a baseline when a third party reveals damaging information about you. So in this condition, after reading about his anti-corruption speech, participants find out from a news source that this politician has misused public funding for personal use. And these passages were pre-tested and showed that students did differentiate between them. So we were good to go there. All right, so moving on to our third condition, the specific confession condition. This is where the politician delivers a specific admission of guilt. So in this condition, after reading about his anti-corruption speech, participants then read a confession he makes admitting that he had misused public funds and he provides this confession in very specific detail. Then participants find out from a third-party news source about his transgression, confirming what he said. So this specific confession is the traditional stealing thunder tactic. And thus far, this is a similar setup to the stealing thunder paradigms that have been done in the literature. All right, so now this is the new thing that I added, the general confession condition, where the politician delivers a general admission of guilt. In this condition, after reading about his anti-corruption speech, participants then read a confession he makes, saying in very general terms that he hasn't always used funds in a proper manner. Right? This is an admission of a broad category of possible misdeeds. Then participants find out from a news source about the details of his specific transgression. So the question is, does this general confession buy you anything over these specific admissions that have been used in the Seal and Thunder paradigms in the literature thus far? And afterwards, participants rated the politician on a number of evaluative dimensions. And after factor analysis, these dimensions clustered into two groups, which I will refer to as the integrity index, which contains the average ratings of honesty, credibility, trustworthiness, sincerity, forgiveness, and transparency, and the global evaluation index, which contains people's attitude towards the politician, as well as their willingness to re-elect him. But for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to talk about the results. The results of the integrity index. But in general, these two indices produce results that are quite similar to each other. So here we see the mean integrity score for the politician when he has done nothing wrong. Right? On a scale between 1 and 7, we get a score of about halfway there. So that's our baseline integrity for the politician. That's basically people looking at a politician and they're saying this politician, when he's done nothing wrong, he's about halfway there in terms of integrity. And the first thing we want to do is establish that the politician who didn't do anything wrong has more integrity than the one who did do something wrong. So what we should see is a lower integrity bar rating, or lower integrity rating for this second bar. And indeed, this is what we saw. A guy who comes out all gung-ho about fighting corruption and ends up being found out as somebody who stole public funds is seen as having lower integrity as a guy who didn't do anything wrong. Fair enough, nothing too surprising here, but a necessary first step. Now, the critical thing is, does stealing thunder help? So what we would expect is that those who steal thunder using very specific confessions, that's this third bar, would get higher ratings than those who didn't make any admissions and was revealed by a third party. That's the second bar. So we should see a third bar that's higher than the second bar if stealing thunder works. And sure enough, making a full confession dramatically improves people's perception of your integrity, arguably to the point of bringing you right back in line with not having done anything wrong at all. So now, so far, that's the traditional stealing thunder paradigm that's been used in the literature. Now, what I added was a general, vague confession, the kind that was used by Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. We want to see if this kind of confession provided any evaluative protection compared to no confession at all. So what we're expecting from this final bar was, if this kind of confession worked, then it should be higher than this second bar. And our results show that no, there's insufficient evidence to conclude that these two groups are different from one another. Now, this was the first study in an ongoing program of research that has since produced several other studies and conceptual replications. And the nice thing about those replications is that they all pretty much produce similar results to this study. And one potential criticism about these kinds of studies, when there are a lot of pairwise contrasts that are run, a lot of analyses are run, is a concern of family-wise error. In that, if you run enough analyses, something's going to end up being a false positive. But the nice thing about having all these replications is that it counters the criticism of family-wise error pretty well. If we get consistent replications of the same effects, it's highly likely that that's a real effect. So these other studies, we looked at things like, okay, so what if we added a moderately specific confession? Or what if things are only this way because the transgression is severe, but with a trivial transgression, like if you only stole $5, all that matters is that you made the confession at all. But the main takeaways for this talk is, across 4 studies thus far, we're seeing consistent results that show very little difference between confessions made at more general levels of detail. the specific confessions work fantastically. But once you start losing the detail, people start evaluating you a lot more harshly, to the point where you might as well not confess at all. So that's a basic takeaway of this talk. If these data are taken at face value and you truly believe in these results, then if you've done something wrong, you should make a full, detailed confession if you're going to confess at all. And you might even walk away being seen as having just as much integrity as if you hadn't done anything wrong in the first place. That's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you. That was interesting. So our next speaker is Dr. Alan Nichols. This is Dr. Nichols' first year at the W. She teaches English and English education classes. She's a doctorate in humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. And prior to moving to Mississippi, she taught technical communication at the University of Texas at Dallas and literature and composition at Richland College. In addition, pedagogical issues. In addition to her teaching issues, her research is in the areas of critical theory and literature, gender studies, and popular culture. She's going to talk to us now on teaching grammar across the English curriculum. Thank you, Dr. Nichols.
Okay, so you can see my screen and hear me, yes? Awesome. So I want to start with a guy named Jeffrey Pullum, who's a linguist and author of the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language. He's written that grammar is presented today much as it was in 1795. So for over 200 years. And this is in spite of the fact that in the last 70 years, there's been amassed a huge amount of research that shows that grammar taught in isolation. So, with the tree structures and the charts and the worksheets we all did in school, doesn't improve students' reading and writing for the most part. So, in fact, it's not uncommon when you talk to students about grammar to learn that where they learned their grammar was in a foreign language class, because that's where it's actually in a context that makes sense, where they have some reason to be doing it. And so it's not surprising that English students tend to hate English grammar. So this past fall, I had the opportunity to teach an advanced grammar class. And knowing the class would be consisting of English majors, I started preparing for it by considering how grammar might be of value to them regardless of their area of interest. And what I came to realize is that careful attention to the language of grammar used in context in college classroom can help students sharpen their skills in reading, writing, and analyzing literature. And so grammar, as I'm defining it here, is the systematic understanding of the structure of language. And it has words that are used to describe it. It has a vocabulary all its own. So just as when somebody studies music, they need to know the names of the notes and staffs and all those things. Or when somebody's learning about biology, especially when they work with DNA, they probably need to know the building blocks of it. People who are doing English need to be able to talk about the grammar of the things that they're reading and writing. Actually, before I go on, one really good example of this is when working with English second language learners, is that students, they kind of come in two varieties: students who've learned English on the streets and those who've learned it in the classroom. And it's much easier to work with students who've learned it in the classroom because they have the words for what they're doing. So for example, if I could say I've got two independent clauses, how do I connect them? Well, with conjunction if we want them in one sentence. Students who don't have those words, we have to give them to them before we can help them understand how their sentence goes together and what works and what doesn't. So sort of traditionally, the areas of the English curriculum are literature and writing, and then we also have teachers' education. And so I wanted to make my class something that worked for students in all of these fields. So I'm going to kind of break down and talk to you about each of them in terms of the grammar. So in teachers' education, the three things that turned out to be pretty important are talking about dialects versus standard American English and having our students understand how to teach that to their students. Because the truth is, nobody actually speaks standard American English. And for our students to understand that is really important because we're all code switching when we write. So I am actually probably, my natural language is pretty close to standard American English, but I say things like, sorry, I covered up there. You gonna do that now? Do you want to go with me? And so teaching our students to teach their students that they actually have to change their language when they write is really important. And it actually works really well. I've done it in basic writing classes and asked the students then to reflect on it. And they're like, wow, I never realized that I'm actually writing something that is different than the way I speak. So we will also want our teachers to know they can give their students opportunities to write both formally and informally, and to take pride in their individual dialects. Let's see, mini lessons are more effective, we've found, than talking for an hour on grammar, half an hour on grammar. 5 minutes, and then get the student involved in doing something with it. And then finally, editing student work is something that our teachers' education students struggle with, because it takes 2 steps. The first one is I need to understand what's gone wrong, and then I need to be able to put words to it so I can talk to the student. So giving students the grammatical words to do that. So grammar can also be used in literary analysis. And I'm going to give you 2 examples here of ways they can help students better understand the work that they're looking at. So this is Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of trouble and by opposing end them. So what's interesting about this is when we start breaking it down grammatically, is we have to be, which is a really odd version of that, because normally to be is a helping verb, right? And it's got a fulcrum in it, or not, sort of the conjunction and the negation. So you've got to be on both sides. So he sets up this very balanced thing, and then he keeps it up. Whether it's noble to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune is balanced against take arms against the sea of trouble. So if you live, you have slings and arrows. If you decide to die, you're taking arms. So weaponry and the outrageous fortune and sea of troubles equate. The difference is, of course, that to live, you suffer, which is passive, whereas to die, you actually do something active. And in the next phrase, Hamlet openly argues in favor of death, only to begin backpedaling, which again brings the concept of living back into the balance. So Shakespeare writes to die, semicolon, to sleep. The semicolon makes the 2 phrases equivalent, and in the next few lines, Hamlet uses the metaphor to great effect, imagining an end to life's troubles. But he pushes the metaphor too far and realizes that when we sleep, we dream, and dreams can be nightmares. So again, the balance shifts, and this time life wins. He uses a number of ways to demonstrate the suffering involved in a long life. So life too is a nightmare. And at this point, both life and death look equally bleak. However, death is the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. So people continue to live because they're afraid of what lies beyond death. And so with this, the seesaw balances over and puts him over on the side of continuing to be alive, even though he's not happy about it. So this is one way that students can look at a piece of writing. And the other one is to, again, looking at dialect and how does dialect talk about identity within a piece of writing. So this is Cheryl Clark's Wearing My Cap Backwards. And she starts off, poets are among the first witches, so suffer none to live or suffer none to be heard, and watch them burn before your eyes, lest they recant and speak their verse in Latin. Very standard American English. Poets are among the first witches. But then she does something interesting. She says, I'm a poet. So she's putting herself with the first witches and sort of the type of power they have. And then she switches her dialect. I speaks in pig Latin. I eats pig feet, a shown up sign of Satan. And so she's establishing her identity as an African-American poet in opposition to the poets whose ears are trained to dactyls and ions. And so she's using her dialect here in a way that states her identity, and that can be really helpful for a student to understand as well. In terms of writing, also, I think bringing in grammar can help strengthen the student's writing. So for example, well, poetry, we do it probably more than anywhere else, because we talk about concrete versus abstract nouns, using nouns and verbs rather than adjectives and adverbs. So a mansion rather than big house. But one game that can be effective is one that I do with my students. I have them come up with 2 piles of cards. One is a list of rhetorical things like repetition, alliteration, exaggeration, simile, and metaphor. And the other one is a list of grammatical terms like noun, verb, conjunction, preposition, and interrogative. And then they start writing anything they want, any story on any topic. And every 5 minutes, somebody draws 2 of these cards, one from each pile. So you get something like repetition of verbs. And for the next 5 minutes, they're going to focus on doing that thing. And it helps them see what kind of a tone they can create using these very specific grammatical structures. And so what I discovered as I was doing the research is that rather than being boring and remedial knowledge that students hate, grammar can be employed across the college English curriculum to help sharpen students, build and sharpen their literary analysis, writing, and teaching skills.
I'm sorry. That was good. I was wanting to hear more. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's interesting. I like the card game. It really makes it practical, doesn't it? So the next group we have to hear from is Dr. Hannah Summerford and Dr. Lisa Hester from the Baccalaureate Nursing Program. Dr. Summerford has 9 years of nursing experience in medical, surgical, women's health, and pediatrics. And she's currently an assistant professor in the BSc program. And Dr. Lisa Hester has 13 years of nursing experience in orthopedics, trauma, and neurosurgery. And she's an assistant professor in our BSM program. They're going to talk to us about the research on reducing hospital readmissions through the clinical navigator. Thank y'all.
Okay, so we're going to share Dr. Hester's screen, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. And so Dr. Hester and myself, prior to working as a nursing instructor now, we both worked in case management. And I would honestly say we didn't just work in case management. We were both very passionate about case management and really enjoyed it. And a lot of people, if you talk about case management, it puts them to sleep, but there really is so much to learn about it. And it's a huge asset to our patients. And so we looked for a problem, and we realized there was a problem with readmission, as there is with many patients in many hospitals. And so we realized that there was a need. And so we honed in on the COPD population, because as we know, that is a diagnosis that tends to be readmitted frequently, such as your CHF patients and those. And so we honed in on the COPD patients to so our data could be more concrete and it would be easier to evaluate. And we piloted the clinical navigator role, which is even a more specific role within the case management team. And so our problem was to work with a task force there in the hospital to review the COPD clinical navigator program. So it was actually a program that we designed for this navigator to complete there in the hospital. And the navigator was a respiratory therapist that we added to our team, and utilizing the data to determine if there were necessary changes in the program, and we prepared a plan including recommendations regarding the program, and then also revising the role of the navigator as needed based on the data we collected.
And so our background, like you said, we picked COPD patients. They're the top 5 readmission diagnosis in Mississippi. They have high risk for non-compliance with outpatient treatment, such as follow-up, smoking cessation, rehabilitation, using their nebulizers. So a lot of the criteria that they have for readmission, if they can be addressed with the navigator, then we're hoping to reduce those readmissions. We focused on Medicare patients only because that's just a financial risk for the hospital. So we conducted the research at North Mississippi Medical Center in Tupelo. And like I said, we did those on Medicare patients only with admitted diagnosis of COPD.
Okay, and so I'm gonna move us on to our methods and materials. So as Lisa just talked about, we talked about the smoking cessation, the nebulizer use, all of that. And then we implemented in July 2018, we actually implemented the clinical navigator role, and it was piloted there in the hospital. And so these patients that were admitted with that diagnosis, the respiratory therapist actually went around and went over each of these with the patient. And we did see a decrease in readmissions, and we saw an increase in the care that they were receiving. And so Lisa can go ahead and do the implications now for practice.
So we interviewed 199 patients, was evaluated between July 2018 and January 2019. And the study showed that the patients who received an evaluation by the clinical navigator had a decrease in readmissions related to their high-risk diagnosis. Follow-up, we implemented a follow-up call center, not only for COPD, but for all of those that were discharged from the hospital with Medicare. We had the follow-up phone call to see, were they keeping their follow-up appointments? Did they get their prescriptions filled? Were they doing what was seeing outpatient rehab or home care seeing them? Were they having those discharge criteria? Were they keeping those in place? The findings were presented to leadership as a clinical navigator role. And like I said, for this one, respiratory therapist was doing this one, but we were looking at others for diabetics, and things like that would be in an RN that might have still been a navigator role. The call center was approved, and they're still doing that today. However, they're not doing the clinical navigator just because of COVID. They would not fund that position at this time with all that they have going on. They've allotted that money elsewhere.
Yes, and so as the end result, the readmission for the COPD population that we targeted, it went from 19% to 16%, which is huge because, as in the hospital, I mean, that's thousands of dollars and that's a lot of patients. And so we were really pleased with our results. We worked with the director of case management while we were doing our study. And so, like Lisa said, they actually created this job after our project, but then due to COVID, they're not currently doing it right now. But it is something that I think once hopefully maybe COVID goes away and patients pick back up and the hospital's back on its feet, I do think it is something that case management, especially in Tupelo, is still looking at doing. But overall, it's not about the money, it's about the patients. And ultimately, patients that are not readmitted, yes, it's great for the hospital as far as saving the money, but ultimately they're receiving, the best care, and they're being able to stay at home, and because they don't want to be in the hospital, just like we don't want them to have to be in the hospital if they don't need to be. So overall, Lisa and I were both really pleased with our study, and that's it. Lisa, do you have anything else?
No. Thank you.
Yes, thank y'all.
Thank you. That was really great. Because you saw a need and then you did a practice change, and that's for you who are not in doctoral nursing programs. That's what we go for our doctorate, is identify a change that needs to be made from a practice viewpoint and make a change. And y'all made a difference, so that's really great.
We did. We enjoyed it. And if anybody wants to talk about case management, you can call me and Lisa, because we get excited about it and it's actually interesting. It's not boring, we promise.
I wonder how many people really understand what case management is.
Nobody does. And our students just had to do a project on it this week and through one of our classes. And anyways, we just really feel their ears full and they don't. So, but yeah, a lot of people, I don't think I don't think I fully understood what it was before working it. So
And just bottom line, this may be wrong because I'm not a case manager, but bottom line, when you're in the hospital, somebody's watching you.
yes, they're
Watching your
always
case,
watching.
and they're managing your case with insurance, doctors, everybody. So you've got a little guardian angel there trying to keep you in and out of the hospital. Is that a safe?
It is. And the funny thing is, people think that they're talking about discharge on discharge. But when actually we start that process on admission, we start when you're admitted with your diagnosis and what we can do with the interview questions to make your stay less and how to be successful at home. And so that starts when we come in and we start asking those questions so that we're getting you ready to go home sooner with more assistance and meeting those needs to keep you from being readmitted to the hospital.
Yeah, when you're in the hospital, you're thinking about acute care needs, but there's so many more needs to patient care than just when they're in the hospital. And so that's really our job, is to anticipate needs and then to meet them before they become a problem.
That's the truth. Well, that's great. And now you know who to talk to if you have any questions about that. So thank y'all. We would like to open up the floor to any questions that you may have for each of our researchers. And hopefully, as people have been writing their listening, as you've been listening to these great presentations, and what a variety, huh? It was really good, yeah. So I would like to open it up and let anybody just unmute themselves and ask a question if you have one for any of our presenters.
Dr. Bliss, what is the cost for capture lecture or lecture capture? Is that the university assumes that cost? How does that work?
So I had spoken with Echo because they gave me a grant. I still have research I have to continue with them anyways. And I've gone to all their conferences for the last several years and been a presenter. Basically, the last proposal that they gave to us was down to about $5 a student for the entire university. It is definitely a lot more than that. They base it on the amount of students that are there. Okay. So when we first started our license at Ole Miss, it was around $20 a student, and the more we added, the cheaper it got. And then they came down to the $5 for us if we wanted to do that and it'd be open for everybody, not just specific classes. Like every student could have it if their instructor were to use it.
There's just so many components to it that are beneficial to the student, especially when we're in the COVID pandemic area now, where a lot of it is online. I think that would help them be engaged and combine all the things they need, the resources they need in one place. That was interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool. I could show you kind of what it looks like if you want sometime.
Dr. Tollison, I see a request there for additional echoes. Whoops. I don't hear a response, Dr. Tollison.
I was trying to find myself. I was on the other screen. I'm not used to having so many people on the screen. I'm instructional technology help too, apparently. But I was on screen too, and I'm like, I know I'm here. But yeah, it is looks like a great product and has a lot of features to it for sure. I thought it was interesting, Dr. Bliss, that you found literature to refute the idea of not pen to paper, that it's not so much learning. But I do wonder if it isn't just the younger generation and not in, I'd be interested to see if it was, I don't know where you went, Dr. Bliss. Anyway, I'd be interested to see if it's in people, 30 and up, in our older students. Do they do better with pen to paper, or is there an age difference? Because I wasn't raised on the computer, so
pen to paper. I was in a meeting the other day, and they said, you may not use your computer for this activity. Pen to paper is what we want you to do. So I thought that was interesting.
Right. And just kind of anecdotal, I had a 43-year-old student in the ECHO class, and I had a 13-year-old student both in that same class. And both of them performed at the same level. And the thing with this active learning platform, like I researched tons of them. I can tell you all the pros and cons of every single active learning platform out there right now if you want to. But when I found this one, everything is so easy to use and everything's within just 3 clicks. And the students, they pick it up quickly. Doesn't really matter their age. There are universities and community colleges that use this exclusively in all of their classes. It's really simple, and for the instructors, it's so much easier than use Zoom to make your video, put it on YouTube, take the link and then put it into Canvas. With this, you just record with their software, and it automatically appears in your Canvas class, so you don't do anything. It's
Wow.
hands-free. It's really, really easy to use.
And you're listening, Dr. Thompson. Good.
We can have those conversations again.
Need to have a committee in nursing. There you go. That's interesting. Your study was very all encompassing. I mean, that was huge, wasn't it?
You have no idea all of the other data that I have. So with the active learning platform, I have their behavioral data. So I know how many minutes they've spent in it. I know what percentage. I can pinpoint exactly what part of the video they stopped watching. So I had to get all of that stuff coded. I have their attendance. I have the amount of words they typed in their notes. I mean, there's so much. And then we have several surveys across the semester. I had research assistants sitting in the class pretending to be students that were observing students and taking notes on their behaviors of what they were doing on their laptops. Like I said, it did take a whole year and a half and 6 RAs to code all of that data. So if you have a question, I'm sure I could show you the data on the answer.
Very, very impressive.
So what did you learn about your videotape lecture? Is there a good length of time? Do you need to condense that and tell them what they need to know rather than all the other anecdotal things that we like to add?
So it depends on what method you're asking. So we've employed this in face-to-face classrooms. We had remote classes for students who are in like Tennessee and other places. And then we also had this in online classes. So for the face-to-face classes, not many students actually went back and really watched those lecture videos because they were the full 50 minutes. The students that did were the students that actually missed class that day, and they would go back and watch. They would watch the whole thing through. I don't know how they could handle that. For the remote classes, not many students actually went back and watched the videos. But for the online classes, any video that was over 12 minutes, we had a huge drop in views. So we kind of just started telling her, because I worked in outreach for a year and a half. So we just started telling everyone 12 minutes is your cap on your lecture videos.
Wow. So do you have to add an activity to make up the other 45 minutes that the university expects you to do with the student? To get
Well,
credit hours, you know what I mean?
for the online classes, what we did was I had to work directly with instructors. I did kind of what Sheila does here. I had to work directly with them to design their classes. Our instructors, they had to go through workshops that I've designed, and basically they had to pass kind of a, do you know what you're doing with this before we let you use it? But it was because we had so much money in it that we didn't want to just give it to all these people and have them not know what's going on. So it's more of a project. So what was I saying? Yeah, we would tell them, have like enough videos to make up the 50 minutes or whatever you would normally do, but just break it into smaller pieces. So I modeled my classes. We have about 6 videos with 10 minutes for each kind of unit. So they have a whole hour of the unit. It's just broken up into pieces.
Okay.
And we did find, because we can embed polls into those videos, as well as in the live lecture classrooms, like the clickers, but they can even text message their answers in if they don't have a smartphone on them. We would do that roughly about every 7 minutes in a face-to-face class to keep them coming back and keeping them engaged. but that wasn't in this particular study. That's other studies that I've done in our general best practice.
Very interesting. There's a lot more we could know about that in there. So anybody else have some questions for some of our other presenters?
I have a question for Andrew, Dr. Wynn. I might have missed if you had
Sure.
controlled for this or not, because my dogs kind of decided to get very excited about your research. But did you assess for like a baseline political affiliation?
No. we
So
didn't do that.
I wonder if they read about someone having a transgression, if they automatically say, well, that's not my party, and that maybe that would have some sort of an interaction, but maybe it wouldn't really matter at all. I don't really know.
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't. I mean, there's not that much research on this particular effect. The closest thing that I know to that is people have looked at the types of transgression. So, uh, competence-based transgression versus, you know, morality-based transgression versus integrity-based transgressions. Um, and it seems like people who who are considering the transgressions to be integrity based, they seem to they seem to evoke stronger ceiling thunder effects than competency based. So far as political party affiliation goes, if you consider some opposing party to be, you know, lower in integrity or, you know, lower in competence, or if the transgression was more in line with the competence-based transgression or integrity-based transgression, then it might be the effect might be more pronounced for integrity-based transgressions versus competence. But we didn't. If we were to look at something like that, we wouldn't necessarily split it based on parties, but maybe based on the degree to which you identify with with the transgressor. So that would cover pretty much any kind of affiliation you might have. Might be party based, might be other groups based, maybe, you know, the your participants are undergrads and the transgressor is another undergrad, so maybe you empathize with this person more, and maybe Ceiling Thunder might work better in that regard. Um, and you know, there's the closest thing to that I know of is there's research showing that if you start off with a negative initial impression of the transgressor, then this Stealing Thunder effect works pretty well. So, for instance, if the transgressor is a company that's, I don't know, Enron or like an evil company, for example, then they come out, they say, "My bad, we made these mistakes," and they spell it in specific detail. The idea is that if you already see them as evil and untrustworthy, this would be such a drastic, you know, decrease. Drastic step away from what you would consider to be normal behavior for them, and therefore that buys them a whole lot of goodwill. Whereas if it's an entity that already is seen as very moral, very high integrity, you already kind of expect this behavior from them. So coming out and making a full admission is, I mean, that's the norm, right? That's kind of expected. So people didn't really we didn't really see that effect for transgressors with high initial, you know, positive affect and positive evaluations. So in that regard, if you, for example, let's say I am a Republican, right? If I see Democrats as low in integrity, then by extension, stealing thunder, a Democrat who steals thunder would actually work really well on me because I'm not expecting Democrats to be like high integrity, but for Republicans, maybe I'm expecting them high integrity. So them stealing thunder wouldn't really work too well. But to answer your question directly, no, we didn't control for that.
So bottom line, it's better to tell the truth.
Not just the truth, but you got to go into very
Details,
specific detail
detailed
about
truth.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've actually made good use of these findings in my life in the past few years. I don't really know. There's no control group, right, in real life, but in my life, there's no duplicate me. But I like to think that, you know, whatever I find in my research, if I truly believe in my research, I gotta use it. Right? Otherwise, I don't really trust what I found.
That's true. That brings me to Elizabeth and Lindsay's research on antibiotic stewardship. I just happen to work in a kind of a very common clinic like you were discussing, and I still use your algorithm, the handout you gave us. It's in a red folder on the desk, and I'll look at it every once in a while and go, one of the practice changes that I did was document better to support my diagnosis. Sometimes you just, it's upper respiratory, but upper respiratory is a catch-all, and it could be a sinusitis or a pharyngitis or a bronchitis, so that was helpful for an audit. By the way, y'all, they didn't tell us who did what, but anyway,
You did, Sally.
I'm sure I was in the, I don't like to give antibiotics or steroids, so don't come to me if you want steroids. But anyway, but just documenting better was a good thing too. So you can justify why you did what you did. Documenting more specifically, maybe. Anyway, or why you did this, even though it didn't meet the criteria. But anyway, it was a very good study, and I thought it was well done, and just educating patients on the idea that 98% of sore throats are viral, and antibiotics don't cure viruses, so that was a good reminder. So it's good.
Thank you.
Questions? I think we could talk one-on-one with each of these groups easy, couldn't we? But in a big group, sometimes it's not quite as easy. So, all right. If there's not any more questions or comments, I think this has been is my committee okay with us saying good night?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much to all of the presenters for your wonderful presentations. Thank you so much to Dr. Morgan for recording for us. So presenters who are interested in receiving a copy of that will be coming in the next few days once we get that from Dr. Morgan. We appreciate all of your time and energy and for taking the time on a Tuesday evening to talk to us about your interest in your research. It was a wonderful opportunity. So thank you all so much. And we hope to see you all back, hopefully face to face next spring for the symposium. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Yes, thank y'all.
Thank y'all.
Good job.